Welcome, everyone, to More Human Than Human, series of interviews organized by the Philip K. Dick Film Festival. Um, as you all know, Philip K. Dick was a writer who was very much inspired by a lot of current scientific and philosophical discussions. And that's why, in the tradition of Philip K. Dick, we continue to explore those areas of human activity that we feel are very relevant and really meaningful to our idea of what it means to be human. And on that note, I'm very proud and happy to bring on board a very famous writer, doctor, who is going to be who's the author of A Burst of Conscious Light, Near Death Experiences, The Shroud of Turin, and the Limitless Potential of Humanity. Dr. Andrew Silverman, thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks.
For those who are not familiar with Dr. Silverman, he's recognized as a leading scientific expert on the Shroud of Turin. Dr. Silverman is a medical doctor with a background in physics. For over 30 years, he's been conducting research on the mind matter continuum, near death experiences, and the shroud. He has presented his findings in peer reviewed scientific papers and at international scientific conferences. He lives in Buckinghamshire, England, and you can reach him at lightoftheshroud.com. Welcome. So,
Thank you.
Dr. Silverman, I came upon your book for those who are not who haven't seen it um, a couple of years ago, and I was immediately taken aback by its conclusions and implications and connections between the Shroud of Turin, near-death experiences, and and consciousness. So I wanted to really open the floor to you and really maybe walk us from the beginning what really has inspired you to write this book. I understand that the Shroud of Turin is back in the news.
Mhm.
Allegedly, is supposedly to be the shroud that covered the body of Jesus Christ. And for many, even though the church doesn't formally believe it is the shroud, for many is an object or relic of worship. But in your book, you explore not just the shroud and its potential, the possibility is much older than what the original statement was. But it also has connections with near-death experiences and consciousness. So if you can please walk us from the beginning, and how you got into what was got you interested in exploring the shroud and its implications.
Certainly, thank you. Yeah, well, it was actually in the 1980s that a friend showed me a video recording of a film that by David Rolfe called Silent Witness, and he actually won a BAFTA award for that film, and it gave a very interesting sort of background in the scientific study that had been done on the shroud, and it was sort of centered around the Shroud of Turin research project team that were a team of mainly scientists, some from worked at NASA, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Los Alamos, and so on, who got together and went to do intensive scientific studies on the shroud in the late 1970s. Of course, they went there imagining it as some kind of religious relic rather than an archaeological artifact, and were therefore sort of expecting to, as they put it, see the brushstrokes in 5 minutes and then they'd be able to go back home again. But they were, without exception, they were astonished at what they found. And what they found was that this was something that couldn't be accounted for in terms of the notion that it had been made by an artist or someone who had done it as a forgery or whatever. This seemed actually to be an object that had forensic evidence on it, that it had once wrapped the body of a recently deceased man who'd been tortured, he'd been whipped, he'd been had a cap of sharp objects placed upon his head, and he'd been crucified, and and this is on there that forensic pathologists have looked at the shroud and confirmed that this is what it shows. But not just that, not just the blood stains and serum stains on the shroud, but also it has the image on it in sepia tones of a man, which at first appears quite indistinct until around the end of the 19th century, 1898. Sigmund Appiah took a photograph and saw, when he looked at the negative, that the negative of the shroud appears like a positive. And I think one of the things that may have led to the STURP team forming to investigate the shroud was that before they went there for 1978, one of the scientists, Dr. John Jackson, using image intensifier that studies the relation between the intensity of an image and distance code, looking for distance coded information, which this is a machine that had been used for interpreting X-rays and so on. And he was amazed that, because if you put an ordinary picture or a photograph in the image intensifier, you get a random set of peaks and troughs. But when you put the shroud image in there, it comes out in three-dimensional relief. And when they studied the nature of the image on there, what they found was that it was only on the outermost fibrils. It's only 200 nanometers in thickness, which is 1/5000th of a millimeter, and doesn't consist of anything that's been added to the cloth, but rather consists of a chemical change in those surface fibrils of oxidation and dehydration, very similar to what happens in paper when it's exposed to sunlight and how it turns yellow. And the STURP team, presenting their findings when interviewed on the silent witness, they said that it appears the only way they can account for how this image could have got there is that there appears to have been a short, intense burst of radiant energy that came from this dead body that had been wrapped in the shroud, which seemed an amazing, conclusion for these scientists. These weren't religious people; they weren't particularly Christian. Some of them were Jewish, some Christian, some, I think, perhaps agnostic. I'm not sure. But this wasn't approached as a relic. It was approached as an artifact, a piece of scientific evidence to be studied. And this is the conclusion that they came to. Now, of course, in 1988, there was carbon dating that was done, which didn't follow the recommendations of the STURP team, but rather decided to take a sample from one of the most contaminated parts of the cloth, which was the corner where it had been most damaged and had always been handled by the corners during all the times it had been displayed to the public and so on. And in the actual, I was actually studying for a science degree, which was done during my medical degree at the time. So I used to read the magazine Nature, in which the report was published every week. And so I was quite fascinated by in one of the corners on one of the pages, they've got a table of the actual data from the 3 different labs, which shows you that 2 of the 3 labs came out with statistically different dates for the shroud, if even allowing for the error in the 2 standard deviations from the figures that they had. It suggested that the pieces of cloth that they had dated were of different ages, and yet they were only about an inch away from each other. Now, then a few years later, some researchers in the US, a couple, Sue Benford and Joe Marino, noticed that that corner of the cloth, and certain studies that had been done, appeared very different to the rest of the cloth. And so they were put forward this theory that maybe that this had been repaired because of damage that could have been done in the 16th century, and there was evidence that that this had actually taken place. Now, Raymond Rogers, who was one of the team that actually had he was a scientist at Los Alamos, a chemist, and he originally, along with the Stirp team, considered that this couldn't have been done by a medieval artist because it couldn't even be done by 20th or 21st century technology, let alone in medieval times, to make the image have the characteristics that it did. But when the carbon dating came out, he said, because he wanted to follow where the evidence led, he said, okay, maybe it is medieval. I can't imagine how. But then Benford and Marino contacted him and with their idea, and he said that I've got he called them fringe researchers, and he said, I've got the material that can prove them wrong in 5 minutes, because I've got samples from the corner and I've got samples from elsewhere on the cloth. And he did the studies, the chemical studies, and he went on the recorded a video, and actually published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal, Thermochimica Acta. He said, I set out to prove them wrong. I've proved them right. The corner that has been dated by the carbon dating team is actually not representative of the rest of the cloth. It has a completely different chemical components, and consists of different proportions of different materials. And so, it may well have been rewoven, which would account for why 2 different out of the 3 labs came out with 2 different ages. And there's so much evidence pointing to this shroud being 2,000 years old, and actually having, from pollen studies, it appears to have been exposed to the elements in March or April in the environs of Jerusalem. And from historical knowledge and evidence regarding the crucifixions that were done by the Romans, there was a period of time between AD or Common Era 6 and 66 when there was a dispensation made by the Romans that they refused to stop crucifying the local people, the Jews, but they at least agreed that they would allow them to have their traditional Jewish burials, which meant that they had to be, once they were dead, they had to be taken off the cross and buried quickly. And that's what we see must have happened on the shroud, because there's no evidence of putrefaction. So this was a man who had been tortured, crucified, had a cap of sharp objects, possibly thorns, placed on his head. And this had happened in the environs of Jerusalem between March and April, between the years 6 and 66. So it would appear to actually have been the historical burial cloth of the man we've come to know as Jesus of Nazareth. Now, when I saw the Silent Witness as I was just a teenager then, but I wanted to think, how could such a thing happen? How could a dead body produce a short, intense burst of radiant energy? And so when I later went on to study science and medicine and so on, that was the sort of idea I set myself to try to understand and explain how such a thing could happen. And it seems to me that in order to do this, one has to ask the question, what is a human being, and how are mind and matter connected? Because surely it's not a coincidence that this individual is one who has had a huge impact on the world through what he taught and how he lived. And could the 2 things be connected? And I look at this in a neutral sense, not in a sense of dogma or any particular religion or denomination. After all, if you actually look at what he taught and what he said, he didn't seem to be sort of recommending institutionalized religions. In fact, when he was questioned about what his intention, his purpose was on earth and in his life, he didn't say, I've come to start a religion. He said, I've come to bear witness to the truth. And the sort of institutions and politics and so on, that all happened later. Not sort of instigated by him, I would say. And so that was the when I came to, after doing a presentation on the shroud at in 2010 at the, it was actually done at ENEA, which is the Italian Atomic Energy Institute, where Dr. Di Lazzaro and his colleagues have done some amazing research on using ultraviolet lasers and have found that, in fact, similar changes to the ones that one can see on the shroud can be produced in tiny parts of a cloth using these lasers. But they say that in order to produce the whole image would have been hundreds of billions of watts, that we can't even do that using modern technology, let alone sort of trying to understand how a medieval artist could have somehow got hold of ultraviolet lasers. Anyway, I did a presentation. I presented a paper on the shroud at that conference, and a friend of mine suggested, why don't I write a book about the shroud? And I realized that in order to write about the shroud, it can't just be about the shroud. It has to be about the nature of human beings, life and death, and the connection between mind and matter, and what is and try to understand how a human being, after all, that was a human being that was there, had that potential, and what that tells us about the potential that we all have. And one of the key points is that I discount for me that there's no need for a notion of supernatural. You see, I would argue, and this is going along with what has been suggested by even some of the founders of quantum theory, such as Erwin Schrödinger and Max Planck, that actually consciousness is fundamental. It's not a product of matter. And actually, time itself is, as Schrödinger more recently, as Andre Linde of Stanford University has pointed out, that you can't have time without consciousness. There can't be change without consciousness, and so if consciousness is absolutely fundamental, and as Schrödinger suggested, we have no beginning or end if we are conscious. Therefore we are eternal, and yet the physical universe appears to have had a beginning at the Big Bang, which implies that when the Big Bang happens, of course, space-time and matter happen. Basically, space-time and matter is another way of saying separation. If we as sentient being predate or exist beyond, I should say, rather than before the Big Bang, if we exist beyond the Big Bang, then where there's no separation, then we're all one there, and with limitless potential, and what we call free will, which even people who notionally don't believe in free will all live their lives as though there is such a thing, which is why, credit or blame is connected to our actions, implying we could have done otherwise. We could only have done otherwise if we have free will. And free will is the biggest clue that mind is fundamental, and that matter is derivative, that matter is actually, because you make a decision to do something, and that choice, which happens in what many people consider to be an abstract in thought, makes physical reality change.
Can I just stop you?
Of course, please do.
For 1 second. Okay, we got a reverb here. Just want to go over a couple of things. Just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. There's a lot of information you just shared. The first thing, I just to backtrack a little bit to the shroud, is that the shroud definitely was not painted on, or it was an image. It seemed to be an image that seemed to be just a millimeter into the actual fiber. But
1/5000th of a millimeter. 5,000 shroud images in 1 millimeter.
Right. So it was definitely not painted. It was certainly not, and what the image reveals, and for those who are not familiar, because I just want to, this is the way the shroud looks, right? Is that not
Mm.
the negative, but this is the way it looks. So it took a while. You said in 1898, when the negative was taken, this is what it looks like. When a picture was
The
taken,
one on the left, yeah.
the one on the left. And so what we're looking at, it's almost like the shroud represents a negative
Mm.
of rather than a positive, but a negative, like the negative of a picture.
Hmm.
Uh, so, being that is the case, you working backwards, then it would suggest that something took a picture of it, like a burst of ultraviolet coming to the
Yes,
body
that would account for the photographic negative properties. It's not a photographic negative, but it has photographic negative properties, and it
properties.
would also account for the distance coding information. And but the
And
another
you,
interesting point, which I hadn't seen myself, but one of the other presenters at Frascati pointed out, and it seemed obvious once he said it, but until then I hadn't noticed, was that if you look at the bloodstains
right,
on the shroud, they don't conform to the pattern of the image. So, for example, there are bloodstains that are superimposed on the hair, and also there's he calls the off-image, what Dr. Lavoie called the off-image elbow stain, which suggests that there were two different processes here.
mm,
That the transfer of the material from the dead body that caused the bloodstains to appear is a simple contact process that happened when the body was presumably supine with the cloth around it, and then when the image formed, it appears as though the cloth was flat, so that the bloodstains from the face are superimposed on the image of the hair. But not only that, as Dr. Lavoie pointed out, what we see on the image is that the hair, you'd expect, if the image had formed while the body was flat on the slab, the hair would be hanging backwards and
right.
out. And also, you would expect to see flattening at the back of the body, for example, the buttocks and the calves and around the shoulders. Now, people say, oh, but there might have been post-mortem there. Now, post-mortem, sorry, not post-mortem, there must have been rigor mortis would have been there. Now, rigor mortis happens to disperse within, particularly if someone has died a violent death, within about 24 hours. But not just that, rigor mortis only affects the muscle tissue. It doesn't affect the skin or the subcutaneous tissue. So what one actually sees, and as I've seen in witnessing autopsies and so on, when a body is laid on a slab, whether or not there's rigor mortis there, you get flattening.
Mm,
But there isn't that flattening, and the hair is not behind him, it's hanging down. So as Dr. Lavoie pointed out, it appears that although the bloodstains formed while the body was lying flat with the cloth wrapped around it, when the image formed, the body was upright.
standing up, right. Mm,
Not quite standing up, because if you look at the feet, they're on different levels. It looks as though, as strange as it may seem, as strange as it may sound, but this is what the scientific evidence is pointing to, that when the image formed, that body was no longer horizontal, but was vertical and somehow suspended above the ground. Now, we
above the
only
ground.
can see this using
Mm,
20th and 21st century techniques. There would have been no way that anyone in medieval times could know this, but it's
right,
interesting that this conforms to sort of anecdotal reports of what happened during the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth, that
right,
he said at times to that people saw it was as though he was shining brighter than the sun, and at
right,
times, it was said that he was once seen to rise above the ground. He was seen to walk on water and so on.
right,
Now, as I say, I don't think we need a notion of miracle or
right.
supernatural. It's interesting, the story of that someone else, that Peter also stepped out and was walking on the water,
Mhm.
and it said that when he began to doubt, then he began to sink.
Right.
Now, what does that imply? It implies that it's actually that, and Jesus himself said it, all these things you see me do, you also can do, and greater
Right.
than these things can you do. So that it implies that somewhere in our will and our minds and our thought, there is a valve that allows or disallows this, whatever it is that into us, that reduces tension or force, that such that it can actually made him lighter, made him able to walk on water and so on. And that it's interesting that we see evidence also on the shroud, that physical evidence that such a thing may have been possible. And so, in terms of understanding how a body could have produced this burst of radiant light, I was fascinated by a point that the physicist David Bohm
Right.
made. In an interview, he pointed out, because someone was asking him, why do you think light is often used as a metaphor in sort of
Mhm.
spiritual discussions, and he made an interesting point, which is actually totally, of course, consistent with what Einstein discovered in relativity. That regarding light, that light, or anything that moves at the speed of light, i.e., has no rest mass, then time and space are less relevant, because for a light beam, the duration of time between its origin and its destination is zero, and the distance between the origin and the destination is also zero. That both, that's light exists, and the Minkowski diagrams, as you know, as they show it on the light cones, which are called the
Mhm.
null cones.
Right.
Because null for zero, because there's actually, if you're on those cones, then there's no distance, and there's no passage of time. And so it's interesting that, as I was saying before about the notion that Bohm was saying about matter being frozen light, that matter, we've perhaps taken on this state of being physical with flesh and so on. Maybe that's not the natural way for consciousness to exist. Perhaps the natural way for consciousness to exist is in a state where we are all one, which Jesus referred to as his Father, and also as
Right.
our Father, and perhaps why he taught love thy neighbor as thyself. That in that fact, that which is still there, that if as I say, beyond the Big Bang rather than before the Big Bang, that we are all one. That's in a timeless state. So in a sense, we still are all one. So our neighbor is ourself, but we don't recognize that enough, and that's how we have momenta of thinking and actions that divide and separate
And on
people from.
that thread, it sort of reminds me of some of the original, without the moralistic overtones of Genesis, or about separation. Separation from, say, Adam and Eve separating from God. It was a separation. And what you're suggesting is that this is the separate, what we're experiencing ourselves and others is a kind of separation that we've intentionally done,
Yeah,
separated from unity, God or primal cause, whatever you want to call it, but we're separated ourselves from. And this, now what is the world then? The world of this sensory world, is this also, is this a kind of a simulation, or is it also part of the separation? How does that come
yeah.
into existence?
Separation is, in a sense, synonymous with space,
And
time, and
time.
matter.
Okay, got it.
And so the physical universe, I would say, is that separation.
Mm,
But it's that separation, as time and space and matter only exist where, by virtue of consciousness existing in this separate state, it's actually, it's very, in a very real sense, it is our separation from each other as sentient beings, and from our separation from our true potential, which makes us therefore, separate individual identities and so on. That's what creates physical universes and makes them persist in existing as material.
Now, one question I have, and I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, is for those who are thinking about what happens after death, well, maybe that will lead us into the next piece of the book, near-death experiences. But is there any kind of sense of personal history, or our personal history just dissolves and we return back to the original consciousness?
Yeah, well, I would suggest that, in the sense that it's interesting, to answer that question, we can look at the evidence from near-death experiences, and what people say is that they perceive this light.
Right.
Many people experience this, and in that light is all compassion and love and
Loving, right.
knowledge, and they feel that light is, in a sense, home, and they feel that many people have a life review,
Right.
where they experience anything that they have done to others, where they have been kind. They feel as though that is being done to them. They experience it from the other person's perspective. Anything that they've done that was harmful, where there was callous or caused harm to other people, they feel what that was like from the other side. They don't feel that they're being judged, but they feel, in a sense, that they're forming a judgment of learning from what was good and what they like and didn't like about their how they lived their life, and so I would suggest that these consequences of our actions are real. We are defined by the choices that we make.
Right.
So it's not so. In a sense, the capacity to become that light isn't the dissolving of our identity. It's our identity reaching its full and infinite potential. You wouldn't cease to exist, but in what we're doing by keeping the momentums that separate and divide, is that we are maintaining the limitations of our identity, which I would suggest would go on beyond death. We would carry them with us. But I think what the man of the shroud demonstrated is that it is possible to live a life where there is no separation, there is no division, where he was truly living up to that notion of loving neighbor as self and so on, and that he achieved a state of that we could describe as the full human potential, that showed that was possible, not a way of sort of ceasing to be or of dissolving your being, but of reaching the full potential of your being, which then becomes limitless. So it's not like a drop that just disappears into the ocean and becomes insignificant. It's about you becoming the ocean.
The ocean. And what are the now that you also mentioned that this also serves as a warning in some ways about the allure of transhumanism and this obsession, or at least in some circles, with creating theoretically a sentient AI, or downloading our consciousness into a computer. So can you just please speak a little bit on that, and how that is actually sort of almost not a correct path to follow?
Yeah, well, that's I would say that could be seen as a big understatement. But yes, the point about consciousness is that, as I believe I demonstrate in the book, other people have
Yeah.
perhaps demonstrated it as well, is that consciousness has no beginning. It can't have a beginning, because time is a product of consciousness. And this is the point that Schrödinger made, that he said, mind is always now. I therefore propose that mind cannot be brought to the fore or ended within time, because mind has created time. Time cannot begin or end the mind. So my consciousness must therefore be eternal. And if mind has no beginning, what does that mean? It means it can't be product of evolution. Okay, so it's not that it sort of suddenly appears through changes in cells and DNA or whatever. If consciousness exists, it must have always existed, and it means it can't be the product of creation. It means that that minds are not made, as it were, out of by God or a god, but must have their. If you want to see the notion of, I'm very careful about using that word because it means so many different things. But if there is that state, people, if you describe it by the properties that people often say, so all-knowing and all powerful and so on, then that would fit with the origin state that I was referring to beyond the Big Bang, where we are all one and have no limitations. And I was suggesting that the separation and therefore the force that happens as a result of separation, just as if you pull a spring apart, it's a tension that from its separation, that separation is what restricts and limits us. And yet there is a state of being completely one, where we have no limitations. Now, the point I'm making is that anything that is a machine, anything that is made of matter, that mind cannot be a product of matter, just as it can't be a product of time. So your brain doesn't make your mind. Okay, any more than an analogy that I often give is that if you hear a radio playing and you hear a song, nobody thinks that the radio is singing to them, okay, or that the radio created that song. And people say, well, oh yes, but that's a good analogy for the brain, because actually you're proving the opponent's view, because if you detune the radio, if you injure the brain, then consciousness seems to stop, or at least there's an interruption in your memory of consciousness. But the same happens if you detune a radio, but the radio waves are still there, the song is still there. It's just you're not hearing it through that radio. Now, the point about any so-called artificial intelligence is that it has to come down in the end to a program. It has to come down to information. Okay, information which can come down to ones and zeros.
Right.
Okay, so the question I ask is, how long does a chain of ones and zeros have to be before suddenly it wakes up and becomes someone rather than something? See, when you see it like that, it's like Professor Sir Roger Penrose said in his book, the title of his book, effectively, The Emperor's New Mind, that it's easily apparent, without needing any sort of sophisticated analysis, to realize that you cannot generate one who can perceive information out of information itself. Just like, you can write a book or your diary you can write all your memories down in your book, but the book, it doesn't wake up and become you, and because those memories are somehow in there. So it's a complete fallacy, this a logical fallacy and a nonsense to suggest that you can take information from your brain and that is you. You can then put it into a machine, a computer, and that's how you have eternal existence, because you can continue in that. But it's a dangerous fallacy, because through people believing in that nonsense, you can see a way that the living human beings could actually become extinct. And that, there was the Astronomer Royal in the UK, Professor Lord Martin Rees. He wrote a book called Our Final Century, where he was talking about how the unanticipated consequences of technology could lead to the end of living human beings. And both he and Stephen Hawking, who were, I believe, both affiliated with at Cambridge University in England,
Yeah.
with an organisation called the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk.
Mm.
That CSER, they came up with the notion that actually one of the most likely ways that humans could become extinct, what one of the biggest existential risks to us is the unanticipated consequence of technology. And in fact, I believe they went on the record, both Stephen Hawking and Lord Martin Rees, as saying that if we ever had contact with the alien civilization, it would probably not be living beings that we would be having contact with.
Right.
It would probably be some kind of type of machine, because once you develop advanced technology, it isn't long before sentient, so-called organic, what they call biological intelligence becomes redundant, and so they expect that human beings will be replaced by
So,
machines.
so my question is this: that's a very important point. Is how does he or you think that that would happen? That people would voluntarily suicide themselves to to download allegedly their consciousness into a machine, or the machines would at some point decide to turn their backs on us or turn on us and
Either way is possible. I mean, and possibly both. I mean, but what some uh, scholars have pointed out is that you have to remember that a machine can't have a notion, it can't have any notion, it can't have any
right.
ideas, because it is just a machine. It can't have a notion of what humanity actually is, or what
Mhm.
sentience is. And it's just blindly following program. So
Right.
if you, for example, program it to ensure that there's no human suffering, the most efficient way of avoiding all human suffering is to wipe out all human beings to the machine. If they're not there, they can't suffer. Or they could all be anesthetized on heroin drips,
Right.
and so they have no pain and no suffering. And also, as you say, through transhumanism, people will voluntarily take on uh, machine implants that may actually then influence what's happening in the brain, and possibly uh, prevent them from, with their mind, influencing their brain through their free will. So that what the problem is, once you lose sight of the uniqueness of
Right.
consciousness, of sentience, and the recognition that is something that's bigger than the universe. Any sentient human being has significance beyond all the atoms in the whole physical universe, because without consciousness there is no universe. And consciousness is the reason why there are things like space, time, and matter, and also the reasons why those those things need not prevail for us, that there is a state of being beyond space, time, and matter. And interestingly, if we're talking about Jesus of Nazareth, he alluded to that when he actually, I would argue, actually referred to the second law of thermodynamics around 2000, about 1900 years before it was discovered, um, by saying that this is a world of moths, rust, and thieves, where everything breaks down.
Right.
Saying that this is a world where everything breaks down, but there's another world, or not another world, another way of, of being, where there is no decay. And of course, if you can exist beyond space, time, and matter, then there's no decay.
Now, I'm often wonder whether those who choose separation, let's say they think that there is no spirit or the spirit is some kind of epiphenomenon, but they believe in AI, in some ways they're endangering their ultimate reunification with the source, with the one mind. I mean, I'm wondering if that is also a danger. That is, if something that is, if you choose to remain separate in spite of all the evidence that we all connected, and in spite of and decide to go along this route, whether it be transhumanism or some other state of separation, would that in any way endanger what happens to them after they die, after they either suicide themselves or they or not? I mean, is there a possibility that that would take place, or is that built into the thinking, or ultimately, no matter what you do, you're still going to return to the source?
Well, I would argue that we do make our own, through our actions and our choices. We
Right.
make our own consequences. So that the the idea that was actually prevalent in pretty much all of the world's major religions originally, is that after death, it's very likely that we may come back again. We may
Right.
we
In
may
reincarnation.
reincarnate.
Right.
And in fact, that was actually alluded to in most of the references to it may have been taken up, but there is one where Jesus is talking to his apostles, and they say, yes, but people say that before that happens, Elijah or Elias has to return. And he said, I tell you, he's already returned, and people didn't recognize him. And it's written that they understood he was talking about John the Baptist. But
Right.
how does someone from several hundred years earlier return as someone else after they've died hundreds of years before, unless
Right.
you're acknowledging that reincarnation is true? But of course, if you put yourself in some kind of technological, you attach your mind, your being in some way onto something that and get caught through your limitations and restrictions in a physical situation where there isn't death, and this notion of wishing, praying for death, but it never comes. You could actually be stuck, so that you not only do you not get to the original source, which is not perhaps an easy thing to do anyway,
Right.
but you can't even reincarnate. You're just stuck in that state. That's the worrying thing, that we can actually, through our limitations and restrictions, that we actually can be stuck. And I mean, in some near-death experiences, they're not all pleasant experiences. People
Right.
do have times where they they see that it's what the place that they were about to go to, that there was a lot of suffering there, but it's not that they're being punished. That's the suffering that they inflicted on others during their life, that they're now feeling.
Feeling.
Um,
Right.
but those people who've, they've been successfully resuscitated, and so many of them have, that's triggered a complete change of mindset, and they live their lives completely differently after that point. But definitely, I think we do make our own destiny to some extent.
There is can you? There's been some anecdotal reports that come out from people who are recovering from near death and near death experiences, where their body floats and they're able to not only see what's happening in another room, or hear the conversations. There is no way they could have possibly heard them while in that
That's
physical
right.
state. Can you speak of some of that? Of some of
Yeah,
those?
I mean, these are known as veridical near-death experiences, and yes, there are many in the literature. The viewers can certainly look it up. One of the most famous is where a doctor on a ward round, meeting a patient who had recently had a cardiac arrest and been resuscitated, tells the doctor that, yes, I was looking at the building from above, and I could see several stories up. There was a slipper on a ledge, and this patient had never been to that level physically,
Right.
and so the physician who the patient spoke to went and actually checked out, and actually found this item there. But there have been many of these, and even, as you say, that there's another famous one was where a patient said where they were looking for the dentures, and said, "Well, it was during the cardiac arrest." It was, and he said, "Which?" He said, "That nurse," and he named them, took it over, and told them where they had put it. How did you know that? You were, you effectively. What people don't realise is that within a few seconds of cardiac arrest, all brain activity effectively ceases. If you have people sort of wired up to an electroencephalogram, the trace it flatlines.
Yes.
It shouldn't be, according to conventional sort of neuroscience, there shouldn't be any conscious brain activity during that time, and definitely not the laying down of new memories, and definitely not the capacity to view what is happening in distant places and report it accurately. So I think, the evidence from NDEs is just one of many things that point to the eternality of consciousness, even though in a sense one doesn't really need it, because from first principles, from looking at it as Schrödinger did, and more recently, as I say, as Andre Linde did, one can see that matter cannot produce mind. It cannot be a derivative of matter, and actually, it's far more likely to be the other way around, that matter exists because of mind. Now, one of the chapters of my book is called "What I Am Not Saying," and I do that because it's so easy to, if I say something like that, people will imagine what I'm saying is that, oh, the world is just a dream, it doesn't really matter, and it's all, then you'll wake up and so on. But to say that is very easy for us living comfortable lives, perhaps, but there are many people in the world who are in agony or starving, and they didn't deserve for that to happen to them, by the way. We inflict that on each other as human beings. But so I would say it's not a dream. It's very real, but it's real
Right.
because we have come into this physical state of existence. But there is another way where we don't have to have that.
Now, Jesus at the end, he says, "I'll give you two commandments." And we always say, you mention one, which is love your neighbor as thyself. But he also says, love your God with all your soul. So what is in this particular,
Yeah.
what is the
So
framework? Does God mean the source, or your original unconditioned self, or this transcendent consciousness? How would we interpret it from based upon this information, this
indeed,
outfit?
I think that was saying that he gave that as a commandment. It's actually what I think, if I remember correctly, he was asking, I think it was Nicodemus, which is the greatest commandment, and he was actually quoting from that's one of the most commonly spoken prayers in Judaism,
Right.
called the Shema, where people say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and I believe Nicodemus was quoting that, and then Jesus quoted another passage from Leviticus, which is love thy neighbor
As I
as
said.
thyself. But I think because it's interesting, because it's very easy to fall into the trap which actually Jesus spoke against, of seeing him up on a pedestal,
Right.
and also therefore seeing God up on a pedestal as well, when actually Jesus said that if he was God's son, then God and he are one and the same. But he also said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. He also said,
Right.
anyone who does my Father's will is my brother, my sister.
Right.
So in that sense, it's loving that the perfection of humanity, the perfection that lies in potential in humanity, and I believe that is what he was referring to, which is also it's real. It exists, even if we don't live up to it. It's still there because it's timeless.
And what practices? I'm hoping maybe there's a book two at some point from this, because it's an amazing book, the burst of. But what practices would you recommend? I mean, we talked about the compassion and a sense of understanding that your neighbor is really yourself, but we're all connected. But what practices would you recommend to help us be more in touch with this sort of like larger consciousness that exists in our conditioned selves? I mean, what meditation, prayer, what would you recommend as being a good path or paths to reach to that level?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that it's to do with how we exist and how we our actions and what motivates them and what they achieve. So I don't think we make it happen by sitting and contemplating. But
Right,
if you want to look at examples of people who, I mean, of course, Jesus of Nazareth himself is perhaps a very good example of it. But if we're looking for examples of people in more modern times, I would say people who devoted their lives to others and through understanding the oneness and equality of all human beings, people like, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, people like that, um, that that they are probably closer to the embodiment of that than we would be by sort of, you know, sitting cross-legged and thinking, oh yes, I am one with my neighbor. If we really believe it, then we have to then we would act out of that knowledge, and our
so
lives would be a testament to it. So it's not. I don't think there is a technique or a mind trick or a practice or that actually does it. But I think that in that there's basically, I see a sort of spectrum of humanity. That on the one extreme you have a psychopath who has no sense of empathy, no sense that
right,
the other human beings to them might just be, you know, lumps of flesh, or they don't have the suffering of those human beings doesn't matter, or they might even enjoy it, that's irrelevant to them. And on the other hand, you have those people who naturally have the feel someone else's pain, or can be happy for someone else's some, you know, positive things that can happen for them, and so on. And so I think that in recognition of sort of the things like my book are only in a sense showing an intellectual way of perceiving it in our mind to see that it makes sense,
right.
but but something uh, only really we can only really make sense to us if we can if we can feel it to be true and become an embodiment of it ourselves, which um, I don't claim to be any example of this at all, but that's what I'm pointing to. I can see some, you know, examples of people who have been closer to that ideal, and they sort of illustrate for all of us, for me as well as for the readers, as sort of the scope that human beings can achieve.
So the work is the laboratory or the work is here on this plane, not necessarily going out and intentionally seeking out other dimensions or other levels of consciousness, but the work is here, and through the work you're saying we'll get more of that connection with the more our true nature.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that reason demonstrates that in just the existence of consciousness, there is we have within us uh, something of the absolute, something that's not relative,
Right,
and so interestingly, the if we take the example of the man who was known as the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, just as Jesus said that anyone who does his father's will, as his brother, his sister, we're all can all be children of God. The Buddha said that all sentient beings are Buddhas, and yet they have been temporarily obscured.
right.
So um, it's not something that we need to. We have awareness and will. We have the capacity to perceive and to make choices, and that in itself is bigger than the universe. But we shrink it down. We twist it and distort it through prejudices, nationalism, racism, materialism, selfishness, anything that diminishes, that sees a separation, that makes a sort of othering of human beings, that makes them in some way less important or matter less to us. That by doing that we make ourselves less, and we have the capacity with our will to go to be at either extreme of that spectrum. But it's not something that you for example, you could say love thy neighbor as thyself is the ultimate would be the ultimate expression of the potential that we can. But you can't, interestingly, you can't actually choose to love. It's not a decision that you make. It's not love if you switch it on like a switch.
Right.
But we may perhaps be able to make ourselves congruent with it, so that it comes natural, that once you actually, it dawns on you that those other people that you see walking around in the street or whatever, that they have feelings just as you do, and recognize that actually, although we all have names now, but our sentience, our line of existence has no beginning, and is eternal and bigger than the universe in its stature and meaning. Then perhaps it would be more difficult for us to be callous or not to have conscience, that if we're hurting another of these human beings.
Yes, there was a passage in the book where you mentioned is about the capacity for empathy.
Mm,
It's a fundamental human quality, and that coincides with the writer Philip K. Dick said in trying to separate a machine from a human being is a capacity for empathy, for
mm,
to be aware of another, and be empathic to another human being. It's really, and that's something that we really need to guard very much,
mm.
and practice.
Yes, because a machine, it can't be aware of empathy. In fact, it can't be aware of anything at all. So
Right,
you could program a machine to perform actions that an external observer would say, oh, it's caring because it's doing something, but actually it's just mechanized. There's no motivation in that machine. It's not actually, because it's interesting actually, because people say, okay, but what is consciousness? What is mind? How do you define it? How do you, if you can't define it, it can't be anything. It doesn't exist, they say. Okay, so how do we define anything? We define it by comparing it to other things. So for example, a cup is a receptacle that can hold liquid. Okay,
right,
so we're comparing it with a thing in which other things can be. But the point about consciousness is it's the very ground of all of none of our experience exists without consciousness, but we have nothing to compare it to. So you can't provide a definition of consciousness that will reduce it to things, to stuff,
right.
because it's not of stuff, it's not of things. And so you can't program into a machine what consciousness is. And yet all the listeners and viewers of this program, they of our discussion, they all, because obviously if they are watching it, experiencing it, they're conscious, and so they know what consciousness is, even though it can't be reduced to a definition that is in terms of things or objects, or in fact of, as I say, of ones and zeros. You cannot construct one who perceives information out of information itself. So an analogy I often give is that if you have people say that consciousness is merely because our brains are processing informations about ourselves. So we have self-awareness and then we're conscious. But if you have a video camera filming its own reflection.
Right.
It's processing information about itself. So does that mean it's therefore conscious by the same definition? Is it an act of murder to switch off the camera? I mean, it's very easy to have a reductio ad absurdum, as one said, to these notions of consciousness being a product of things or of matter or of information. We are,
Where does math fit in? The idea of numbers or these very abstract symbology, is that an aspect of consciousness, or is that something that exists in the world that when we came into the world? Where would that that spectrum would that fit in?
yeah. Well, uh, it's interesting that people have looked on this before, and actually, if you read Roger Penrose's work, he points to the somehow these. It seems to have an existence, a reality of its own. But I would say that it is the connections between separate points that become apparent and exposed when separation happens. So in a sense,
Mm,
in the state beyond the Big Bang, it is zero because it's not a thing. It's no thing. It
right.
is one because there's no separation, and it is infinite because it has no limitations. And in a sense, the physical universes happen when zero is divided by zero. that that and all the numbers are a result of that. Although mathematicians would conventionally say that that doesn't mean anything. Zero divided by zero is undefined, they say. But out of no thingness comes all things. But the point that I make in the book is that as human beings, we are not things. We are way beyond thingness, if you like, and that consciousness exists where there's no things.
Right.
And we're not a thing, and the state beyond the Big Bang, there's no things there. There's no objects. There's no substance, but there is all knowledge and all of us as sentient being, all existing there in our full potential, which contains each other.
Fantastic. Well, I think on that note, I like to end this. But Doctor, is there? Do you have any plans for any? First of all, what do you have plans for writing another book or an extension, or it's a standalone? Standalone, and what are future plans or conferences that the audiences who want to follow your work may want to keep up with?
Yeah. Well, I do have some ideas. There may be a second book on the way at some point. It may not be very soon. I'm quite busy with my medical work, but
Absolutely.
no. Yeah, I suspect there will be a second book before too long.
Fantastic, fantastic. It really has been a very exciting, very stimulating discussion. I think this is something that we all need to be aware of. And for those who are again not familiar or haven't heard, this is a great book. And I will put the link below, as well as your website. Where is the best place to get your book? Directly from your website, or should they go to the more
Yeah.
traditional?
Sure. I don't actually. It's published by inner traditions, and it's can be bought from bookshops, and you can get it from Amazon. On my website andrewsilverman.co.uk, there's a link to buying it, but it's not me selling it. That's a link that
To
takes you to
Amazon?
Amazon to buy it. But I suppose it's nice to support local bookshops, and people can get it from.
Absolutely. And there are very few that exist. Definitely, let's support them before they all like merge into the AI. And we need to, this is an ongoing challenge. Well, again, thank you, Dr. Silverman, for really for your time and for really sharing the insights personally. And I think for a lot of our viewers who are wondering, who are seem to be lost in the wilderness, and some people wondering what's going on. This is We have it inside ourselves. We're ready. We just need to be there and help others. Uh,
Mm.
and connect with others in a charitable, and we all part of the same source. So again, thank you very much for your time, and we'll be in touch. And I'll make sure that the links are there for those who want to reach out to you or want to get your books.
That's very kind. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Thank you. Please keep us posted on any developments, because we always want to know what's next, and on this special journey we're in, the special
Mm,
Earth.
mm.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you. Take care.
You have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of a Burst of Conscious Light interview with Dr. Silverman. I hope you liked it. I also wanted to make sure that if you're on our Facebook channel, please like the page, spread the word. If you are on YouTube channel, please subscribe and like the page as well. As you know, we do depend on artificial intelligence, those algorithms to keep on top of our game. And I want to make sure that everybody is really any comments you want to have regarding this and other authors, please do so. Stay in touch, because next week we'll be having an interview also on the concept of the light with James Tunney next Thursday. So again, thank you for joining me. Stay well, and let's all help ourselves and help each other, as love thy neighbor as thyself. Thank you. You have a good day, and see you soon. Bye bye.